Howdy, ESSM 406. In this video, I want to give you a little bit of a sort of intellectual background for studying uh, communities and collaboration. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some intellectual history and my own relationship, because actually my work relates to some of what we're discussing in this unit. So in the previous unit, we read an essay by Garrett Hardin, The Tragedy of the Commons, right? And this is actually one of the most famous essays ever published in a scientific magazine. It's been very widely cited. It's been very influential in terms of how people think about policy. And in that essay, Garrett Hardin basically proses a problem, right? The tragedy of the commons. And then he says, well, there's two kinds of solutions. We could have the government step in and divide up the property so everyone has individual private property rights. Or we could have the government regulate how many cattle can graze in the commons, in the grazing commons. And this became kind of the gospel truth and what policy recommendations existed for environmental policy. Either you need to privatize or you need to impose sort of prescriptive command and control regulation. Privatize, create private property rights, or put in a prescriptive command and control regulation. A lot of people, mostly anthropologists actually, were studying communities that had managed their natural resources for a long time. And Andreas and Jansen talk a little bit about this history and some of the different classic examples. So people were studying people who actually had grazing commons, just like Hardin described, in the Swiss Alps. And these people, it turned out you can actually find documents. The Swiss are very good at keeping records. You can find documents demonstrating how they've been managing these grazing commons for the last 1,000 years, and they're quite sustainable, contrary to everything that Garrett Hardin said. There were people studying fisheries, and it seems like Hardin's examples would apply just as well to fisheries, that they tend to be over-harvested. But they found that certain fisheries weren't over-harvested. Similarly, forests, you might think that forests would be over-harvested, and Agrawal talks about this in his essay about Nepal. We actually found that many of these communities were not over-harvesting. So what's going on here? Well, in the 1980s, a group of anthropologists and geographers and political scientists, some natural resource managers got together, commissioned by the National Research Council, actually, a national scientific body. What's going on here? How come commons are sometimes managed? And the leader of that group was a woman named Elinor Ostrom. Elinor Ostrom was my mentor. She passed away a couple years ago. But before she passed away, she actually became the first and so far only woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And she wasn't even an economist. She was actually a political scientist. And her fundamental insight was that there's certain characteristics that tend to lead communities to be able to manage their resources sustainably together. She didn't say any community can manage their natural resources sustainably. She didn't say we don't need a government. She said under certain circumstances, communities will be successful in managing their resources. And they don't need these two kind of polar solutions that Hardin proposed of imposing private property rights or having the government tell people what to do. And this is actually, when you think about it, there's an intuition here that's not terribly surprising. I don't know how many of you live with a group of your friends in college, but that's a common way for college students to live. You live in a house with 3, 4, 5. I lived with 10 friends at one point when I was an undergraduate. And you have to figure out ways, how are we going to keep our house clean? Well, maybe some of you don't keep your house clean at all, but I bet you've been to some house where there's 4 or 5 college students living together and they do a pretty good job of cleaning. Well, how do they do it? Often they come up with certain sets of rules that they're going to use to manage their resources in common. Okay, someone cleans on this day, someone's responsible for cleaning this. If you make this kind of mess, you have to clean it up yourself. These kind of messes everyone is responsible for, etc. So the same thing happens at a larger scale with these communities that manage natural resources. They come up with rules, what Elinor Ostrom called institutions, which she basically meant rules. that enable them to manage the resources sustainably. And she published this book, which I'm having you read an excerpt from, called Governing the Commons. And it's why she won the Nobel Prize. So you're reading a Nobel Prize winning work. I'm trying to keep these videos short, so I'm going to talk about what exactly she found, what she called her design principles for sustainable resource use. I'll talk about that in the next video.